All right. So, thanks everyone for joining. Just a quick question. Can you still hear me from the people who are connected remotely, like 30 odd people?
Yes, clear.
Awesome. All right. I will start by saying welcome to this Data Discovery Paradigms Interest Group session. It's the last day of the RDA almost, so I know everyone is kind of exhausted by this time. So hopefully we'll make this a more interesting and engaging discussion for the next hour and a half. So the idea of the discussion today is about recommendations for data repositories to improve data discoverability, as the title implies. So just in case we have newcomers to the group here, I'll start with a quick overview of what the, there we go. Oh, sorry, welcome. That's perfect. So as you've probably heard already, this session has been recorded. So for the people who are remote, just if you don't want to be being on the recording, you can keep your camera and microphone off, and then I'll try to keep you have an eye on the chat window in any case, like here. Yes. The collaborative notes are here. I've already pasted this both on the chat window as well as Mukbang and on the Hoove app, so it will be easier for you to actually click on it. And if you are able to provide your information on the sign-in table there, that would be quite useful, given that we have a lot of participants today here. So, where's the mic? There's my mic. What's the agenda? So in the beginning, I'll start with a very quick overview of what the group is all about, what we've been doing for the past X number of years. And then we'll go directly to the main part of the discussion, which is about a draft of the 10 simple rules for data repositories or catalogs to improve data discoverability. Kathleen will give a quick overview of this particular effort so far. And then the idea would be for us to actually discuss the rules that we have been putting together on our monthly calls over the past 9 months, more or less. So the plan, as you can see from the slides, we're going to have like breakout rooms. Given how this is organized here, I think it's unlikely to consider any kind of a breakout room. So we'll probably continue this discussion all together here, and we'll take the rules one by one. I'll try to keep as detailed notes as possible, so I'll move to the notes at some point. But the idea is here to actually have a more in-depth discussion of what are the rules about, what we want to consider, ultimately leading towards an actual white paper. At the end, we're going to do a quick wrap-up, a few quick announcements, and then we kind of wrap the session. So that's the idea of today. I'll start now about the DTP, Data Discovery Paradigms Interest Group. So the main motivation started from, as you can imagine, the FAIR principles. I know this is a huge surprise for everyone, specifically for the F part, so the findability, and to be actually more particular to F3, which is about metadata that are registered or indexed in a searchable resource. So this is a quite broad mandate if you actually start thinking about it. So the idea here was to figure out what would be the best paradigms, as the name implies, to facilitate this kind of data discoverability. So there are three main components in any kind of an effort in that front. You have on one hand the actual users. So the users, again, could be interpreted in different ways. It could be the consumers, it could be the researchers, it could be other infrastructures, but essentially the users in this point of view are essentially the stakeholders that have the data needs. Then you have the data discovery service, which lies somewhere in the middle. And then on the other hand, you have data catalogs, data registries, data providers, everyone that actually provides this information. So what we're trying to figure out in this interest group is basically what are the key components, or how can we improve this particular kind of a flow in any kind of all those three components. So if you look at the chart itself, from, I think the first one was planted in Denver, like P6, P7, something like that. The main idea was to figure out what are the key requirements, the expectations, the issues, the challenges that exist around data discoverability. and to provide kind of a place where this can be discussed. So this is sort of the one object. The second, which is much more interesting, is to actually provide some actionable recommendations. So this is another working group, so any kind of an outcome is not the traditional outcome of a working group, but we've been working in a way that we are spinning off task forces and so working groups, with the data granularity one, which has a session right after Lattice being one of those, to actually focus on particular components of that. And this is completely community driven, so depending on the perspectives of the contributors, we go in respective directions. Let me check that. Thank you. Right. So, what's my progress? Right. So the kickoff was in P8. All right. So it was close enough. At that time, we had also a quick survey within the community of the interest group about what would be the potential short-term activities that we should be looking into. And based on that, we had 4 task forces at the time: guidelines for making the data findable, use cases, metadata enrichment, and relevancy tracking. Over the next couple of years, we had these task forces provide some draft outputs, and at P10 we actually provided, as an interest group, 3 supporting outputs to use the RDA lingo. And you can see them here. Some of them are quite extensively viewed, some have been quite extensively used, which is always a very good outcome of any kind of interest group. In P11, we considered these 3 task forces sort of completed, and we had another iteration trying to figure out what are the next steps. The output, as you can see, we have the corresponding cards here. So if you want to find what the catalog, if you go to the website, there's a catalog of all outputs, and then you'll find the RDA, the data discovery ones as well. It's quite interesting because they are summarizing quite effectively all the outputs of like 3 articles, but it's quite useful to have them capsuled together. From then onwards, we focused more on 3 new task forces: metadata enrichment, data discovery and granularity, which again span off on an actual working group, and the schema.org. P14, which I think was in Botswana, we had the kickoff of the research metadata schemas working group, and then we had sort of continuous interactions across the different task forces. The working group of data granularity was endorsed in P17, and basically bring us fast forwarding to today, because over the last 2-3 hybrid/virtual plenaries, we basically continue this work in as much as we could. Right, so that I think is the quick version, quick update on what the data discovery paradigms in this group is all about. And now I will yield the floor to Kathleen to continue with the next part. Kathleen, are you still around?
Yes, I'm still here. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly fine. Do you want me to continue staying slide, or do you want to do it yourself?
If you could do it, that would be great, Fotis.
Awesome.
So,
let me know.
Yeah.
Let me actually put your face here as well.
Oh, great.
Just know who is actually talking. There you go. Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks.
Super. Thanks. So if you could just go to the next slide, I think. Great. So as Fotis went over, we've had a couple of different outputs from this group, some of which were geared more toward people who are searching for data. Then we had more from the repository perspective, looking at what people are actually doing in this space. So what we really wanted to do with this document is to develop something that repositories can actually use, kind of in the nature of this quick tips type of output that repositories can use and go to in order to take different steps in order to increase the discoverability of their own data. So that's kind of the motivation behind developing this particular document. So since the last plenary, which I guess has been 9 months ago, we've been meeting monthly and have been really brainstorming in this document that's linked here from the slides to think about this from different ways. As you can see, if you're in the document itself, this is really only a draft. It is quite messy. And we decided to leave it that way for this plenary session because we really want to engage in this document with all of you and to get your ideas about what we can develop and recommend for repositories. So some of these rules are a little bit more developed than others, but we envision each of them having an overall structure where we would provide some type of the motivation for why we think this is important. Then we would get into the recommendation itself. And then, as you'll see, many of the rules are themselves connected to each other. So we would want to link between the rules to find those connections and to help make that be a little bit easier for the reader. So Fotis, if you could go to the next slide. Then we'll just give a really quick overview of the rules that we've thought of so far, and then we'll just dive into the discussion. So the first rule is about user studies. So the idea here is to provide guidance for repositories who want to engage in studies about their users to understand more about their needs and how they're searching for data in the repositories. So here we're drawing on lots of research that's been done in the information retrieval and information seeking landscape to provide kind of examples of different methods of what repositories could do. Then the second and third rules that we've come up with so far really draw on past research about how researchers are discovering data. So we know that web search, so searching on a search engine like Google, for example, as well as the academic literature are really important and common ways for researchers to find data. So we want in these rules to help repositories think about what they can do in order to make their data more discoverable to search engines, as well as to make their data more linked and discoverable through the literature in different ways. The fourth rule, I guess it's more from the technical perspective here. So interdisciplinary search for data, I guess, is challenging for users as well, but it's especially challenging in terms of the different metadata schemas that need to be integrated and brought together, some of which are very discipline specific. So here we're thinking of something that's kind of more addressing this challenge of how to deal with these diverse metadata schemas. The fifth rule is one that maybe you're familiar with, especially if you're working in a repository landscape, is the challenge of having duplicate records for the same data. And this can look differently also. There could be the same data described in different records, or there could be one record that augments another record. So these different types of duplication is a problem that we need to help repositories to think about and to address in terms of data search. So then the next slide, if you could go there, Fotis, and we can think about the rest of these rules that we've come up with. We know from, again, research in how users are searching for data that there's a tendency to use really broad search terms, even though researchers tend to have very specific data needs. So here we're trying to think about how we can help repositories to match that, that behavior and deal with that behavior, maybe to infer a user search term from this broad search that they might perform, or how to suggest kind of auto-completion of terms based on these broader search terms. The next rule also has to deal with how we know users interact with certain data. For example, for survey data or for more structured data, there is a need for users to be able to search by particular variables. So how can we actually facilitate that type of searching from the repository perspective? That's what we would like to brainstorm about with that rule. 8 and 9 are perhaps no surprise that we're back to metadata here. Number 8, we have identified kind of a differentiation in types of metadata needs. One is from the user perspective, where researchers might need to know certain things about data, which would be described in metadata. And then the other is more the machine-to-machine perspective, where if a search query, this would have to do more with federated search, where if a search query was issued and then distributed to multiple repositories, we would need to have some type of integration of the metadata schemas that are being used at that machine-to-machine level. And I'm sure this is not a surprise that the metadata quality of data is not always the greatest. So this is something that we need to continue to think about at the repository level, is how to continue to improve the quality of metadata, which of course impacts both search and potential reuse. Number 10 feels a little bit like somehow as it's listed here, it feels a little bit like an outlier, but of course it's integrated into the other rules also. And this is the importance of having persistent identifiers at varying levels for multiple types of things. So this is what we've been thinking of now in the group. And Fotis, if you could go to the next slide. We see that some of these rules that we've brainstormed have more of a user experience tendency. Some of them are more focused toward metadata. Some of them fall into both of these groups. And I think the original idea was to discuss these in these two groups, but I'm not sure if we're going to do that anymore, if we'll just go through the rules themselves top to bottom. So Fotis, I pass it back to you to think about the logistics of the discussion here about how we're going forward.
All right, thanks, Kathleen. Let me check. So first of all, sorry, go back. As you can see, this is sort of the first outcome draft of discussions we have had in our monthly calls over the past few months. Based on the structure of this room, I think it's unlikely to aim for any kind of a breakout discussion, even if we want to split this between the 40 people who are online and the X number of people who are face-to-face in this room. At the same time, I'm not sure if it makes sense to go through them one by one, given that we already have an organizational structure across these two points. So what I would propose is I'm going to stop sharing the slides. I'll go direct to the Google document, and we can start discussing the structure of these rules, the remit, the motivations across those. I can try to keep some notes, and based on that, try to expand them as much as possible so that we can actually move forward to an actual recommendation at the end. Sounds like a reasonable plan? Mm-hmm. I see people nodding. I don't hear objections online, so that's always a good thing. So this means that I can stop doing that and I can go to this part. Yes. So let me see if I can do this at the same time. So again, I'm pasting, this is the shared document, because if I scroll a bit down, go away. I need a mouse. There we go. So this is essentially the links to the two documents. Let me see if I can increase this slightly so that everyone can see. That's better, right?
F11 to make it full screen.
F11 to make it full screen, all right. Okay, how about this F11?
Yes.
All right, so
are you sharing this document now with the?
I think I'm sharing the entire screen.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes,
good,
because I see you there as well. Cool, thanks. So what I'll do, I'll start with the first group, which is about improving the user experience. I'll share this document again on the screen and I'll start the discussion on that. What I would propose to have as a setup, I'll go through the notes, mostly reading through them, and then I will open the floor for any comments, discussion. I'll also keep an eye on the chat window so that we have the virtual participants actively contribute as well here. So let me open this one as well. All right. Wait, this is going to be a bit difficult now with the, okay, I cannot shift through, okay, go away. Right, so this started very promisingly, but it had an issue with me shifting between documents. So this is the 10 articles, and I'll go here. This is how we keep the notes. So I'll copy the rules every time, and I'll go directly, wait, sorry, I'm trying to help the people in the room as well, because this starts being a bit problematic with a tiny window. Almost there, moving things around slightly. Right, so.
Fotis,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but online we only see the slide. We don't see the
Oh,
10 things
That was a
document.
good point.
Screen sharing is paused.
I see that. So let me have
Do you
this.
want me to share the 10 simple rules document?
No, I will
if
share my
you
entire
can-
screen, and it'll be easier, I think, instead of like trying to figure out which particular part is going to be shared. Right, so this is our collaborative notes. I opened, this is the actual article with our notes, and these are the notes we will be keeping for every rule if we go that direction in any case. So the recommendations are start with the first section, which is the user experience. The rule number 1 is about the user study. So I'll go direct to rule 1. So the rule by itself is about the user studies to choose an appropriate method. And the motivation itself of this particular rule is to help detect usability issues. Let me increase this again slightly. Yes, significantly better. Helps detect the usability issues, prevent users from making mistakes, and enhances the user satisfaction, and also designed for actual rather than imagined needs. Yes.
So with a user study, is this before you're building? As you're building, something that users will be able to read? Can you describe them a little bit more or give us an example of a user study?
All right, so let me see if there's anyone else here. Okay, so the idea here is how to implement the data repositories in order to facilitate user studies.
Okay.
And the idea here is, the recommendation, as you can see, is to have the appropriate method for conducting user studies in that extent. There is a wide history of UX and literature to draw. Some of these methods have been applied to data search, some have not. And then we have different methods for different kind of setups. Come on, move, thank you. And there are a few, there's a table here of possible methods, as you can see. There's the interview, the survey, observation, the field study, the log analysis. I have no idea what this one is, as I'm not very familiar with all of those things. User testing with actual real or simulated tasks, think aloud tasks, focus groups, heuristics, all of those were captured as potential ideas about how to run user experiences in user studies. Yes.
What do I see? These rules are for repositories in general, right? But repositories about user stories are a particular case.
So the rules themselves are for repositories and data catalogs. I mean, that's the whole point. The reason for these rules is which rules do you need to keep in mind to improve the data discoverability of the whole thing, of your resource. In this particular case, the question is, which are the list of the methods that exist so that you can do a user study for your own repository. You may not have everything, you may not cater for everything, but at least for the task, for the stakeholders that you serve, what are the approaches that you need to be taking consideration?
So this is to enable user studies research on top of your repository.
To improve the discoverability, yes. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 questions, so please go ahead.
So maybe instead of having a noun, as a rule, you should perform user stories or something. It makes it more understandable.
An action.
Yeah,
I think this
User
is.
stories.
I think this was the alternative title where we are still brainstorming about.
I think just saying perform user studies.
Yeah, perform would be better.
I was thinking know your user if you actually aim at the
Yeah.
repository.
Wait, come on.
Actually, I thought you meant choose a methodology to perform user studies. Is that what you meant?
I think that's,
I think this is sort of the recommendations to actually choose the appropriate method based on what you're trying to figure out, because every method has a different kind of affordances and so forth. So you're absolutely right.
I'm not sure choosing one is really relevant because there are some things that are logs and some other things that are surveys, and the good thing should be combining them rather than choosing one.
You can also use more than one method.
You should
I
also
think.
or use almost all of them, to be honest, because you always have some logs, and you can use something to look at, for example, eye tracking or mouse tracking.
All right.
What you
So
want to do is to know how the users use the data repository to improve it and to iteratively make it better.
all right. So one time, because I need to also keep notes and people sort of like putting ideas here, which is awesome. I like it, but I have to sort of keep track.
But you have the recording shoes, so.
Do you want me to do the notes so you can?
That would be awesome. Yes, Mikey, please.
Yeah, I was wondering about does this also cover defining personas, etc., which is sort of maybe helping you to identify which methods you want to use for different categories of end users?
I think personas is not a bad idea. I don't remember mentioning it at some point, so that's why I had a quick look here. If there is somewhere else, but I think a persona idea is actually quite a good point here.
Because I think that can also help to inform many of the other suggested rules.
All right, so there's one hand from the room. So Kirsten, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I really like your approach, but I would like to ask you to better define users, because like I'm running a domain repository at GFZ, and if I would call users the researchers who are using our repository to publish their data. If I ask them how they use it, they just say, no, I just want to write my paper and have the data online. If you ask me as the repository manager, I would like to pay a lot of attention of including PIDs, of making rich metadata, including controlled vocabularies that can then be used to build ontologies, etc. pp. So I think just asking for user stories, we need to define who are the users. Are your users repositories? Then we have to take different approaches, and we have to rather teach them what is essential and how, for example, other repositories are using metadata to improve discoverability, etc.
I think there's a comment here. Brigitte?
Yes, I mean, this is not the only rule, or the only thing that we would recommend. The idea is there that it's important to do user studies, but you cannot find out everything from user studies. Like the users are telling you their problems, they don't tell you your solutions. And that is, I think, a very important thing to keep in mind, that just out of this user thing, you cannot have the idea repository. On the other hand, if you completely ignore your users, that is also a problem. So yeah.
It's about expectation management, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but then, sorry, just to add, then this would mean that your users are repositories, okay?
So I would argue that, so let me put in, and there's another hand there. So as I see it, these rules are for the actual catalog repository to define. So if I had a repository and I expect that my users were like the researchers, the end users, the consumers of the data, I would define my user study based on that. The methods are here, but I have a completely different audience from another repository catalog, which aims for other repositories to be the end user. So I would consider this rule as the guideline that any kind of repository should have in mind if you're aiming for a user study. At least that's sort of my interpretation of that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think considering the online remark, it's still very relevant, even if you consider the use case of deposit or I don't care, just one easy thing, because you can still with these methods identify where the user tends to lag out in the process or what is difficult. And that can be also the approach to identify even at this level, not only on the discovery side.
I think so this feels to me more than a method, but I may be wrong. And it seems to be that bit close to how this is sort of interacts with the repository itself.
Could be, well, several can answer this need, but it's just saying that having those kind of studies in a very broad term isn't incompatible with the use case of only deposit or I only want something basic, whereas as a repository manager, you want to apply the following rules or having something more detailed.
Okay.
I think this is about stories, not about specifications.
So let me put this.
Photos, can I clarify that the users here, we mean those people, or could be, you know, another machine API come to a repository trying to find the data, not the type of users, they trying to publish or supply metadata to the repository.
Yes, Maggie, please.
But there is a little bit of a tie-in between what the depositors are doing and of course what your rules are at the repository level and the end user ability to discover things, because you have to train and inform the depositors so that they describe their data in a way that is actually going to aid discovery, maybe not only for the first intended user group, but in a more general sense. So you also have to think about that, both as being a repository and as a depositor.
Kathleen has a hand and then Graham. Kathleen, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think to Maggie's question, I think that ties in nicely with the rule that we have later about improving metadata quality, because that is an important part. But really, I think we need to keep in mind that this is a list of 10 rules. And the aim with this first rule was thinking about users as data seekers, as data searchers, as people who are coming to a repository looking for data. So that's kind of the background of these user studies, to see what type of information we can get about the data that people are needing, about how they are actually searching in a repository. But of course, it's all very related and linked to these other ideas of like a person being a data depositor. That's why we tried to address those in the later rules from the perspective of the metadata. But that's definitely a good point to raise.
Thanks, Graham, please.
Yeah, so I was going to say, actually, kind of the rule, if you want to short the title, is be stakeholder engaged, because your stakeholders are going to be multiple here. You know, as part of the whole sort of data life cycle. You know, from the data providers, you have to be engaged with them and what they're actually doing, because the information they provide is going to feed down the line. Yeah, I know it's going to come on later on about kind of the quality of the metadata and what you can harvest and so on and so forth. But you also have to be engaged with the people who are providing your pipelines and making sure they're meeting the end user needs. That all has to be kind of part of the, you know, what you're doing here. I think kind of that for the rules were be that, but then kind of what we're listing underneath is kind of these are approaches to take to do that, and to kind of like, you know, one thing to be and one thing, and then the rest is kind of the, you know, the motivation, the kind of the methodology is how to do it.
I fully agree on that. Let me see if there's a hand on the Zoom. No, all right. So just to see if I can move to the next one. And again, this is the same approach across all. The rule itself is sort of, we try to define it here. Then we have why we believe that this rule is needed. And then, as Graham just said, some ideas of how this can be ultimately implemented. So from my understanding so far in the discussion, there is basically no major objection onto this rule itself, the motivation and the goals, but sort of figure out what the actual details might be required.
Yeah, just one last remark.
please.
You can consider this from a human-computer interaction point of view. So there is the looks and the usability. So depending on the kind of thing you are aiming for, you are either aiming for, let us say, functionality and performance, or you're aiming for ease of use. Okay, so afterwards, you just not of the title, but on the discussion, you might divide your methods, because I see a clear distinction on your list of methods between performance, okay, and usability in terms of friendliness.
Yeah, excellent
That's all.
point. That's a good point. So something definitely to keep in mind for the recommendations under this rule. All right, so let me see if I can move to the next one, which is, well, I'm struggling with two computers. I'm leveling up. So rule 2 is basically the web part. So let me go to the second rule, scroll it down. There we go. There we go. So the title itself, or the proposed title, is the one below. Essentially, for repositories, to improve the web presence, discoverability, or web search engine optimization. In other words, make sure that even if you have your repository here, make sure that people can find that it actually exists. The motivation of this particular rule is that web search, or Googling stuff, is the most common way to actually find data. I know I'm doing that. And even for literature, sometimes you actually still need to do a web search to locate the data set itself. And this has been shown in some of the outlines here. And the recommendations based on that is, so for example, use web standards like schema.org, make the search engine optimization efforts to increase this kind of searchability, connect to a domain that has a high page rank, which again has its own challenges. Make sure that there might be informal names that are used in literature, and this should also be part of the metadata in this effort. Use standard APIs, and then be a bit more person oriented, which is like the social presence, how to ensure that information of this repository is also linked to the corresponding disciplinary communities. Of course, there are links to other rules under this one, for example, the user size that we just discussed, the PIDs, literature, and the metadata quality. But as a rule itself, and I go back to the same point, is to, the rule would be for a data repository to increase their web presence as much as possible. Yes, please.
Are you now talking about presence of the repository itself, so the name, the language archive, for instance, or about content, the metadata content of the repository? Because these are two different things, right?
Both. So for many of the, like there are different pathways on how people use web presence, but for me, the most critical one is the one where you read a paper, you find the name of the data set, you type it in Google, and then you find the landing page basically. That should absolutely work. If that doesn't work, you have a problem. But also, your repository should also be known, because otherwise
we're talking about discovery. So
yeah,
you don't know it exists. So you should be presented with an opportunity to see new material.
Yes.
And there, perhaps, I think the name of the archive or of the repository is more interesting than of the finding the data set that you know already exists.
I agree with it, and also, but I think it's something that you need to do both. Because in many cases, people will find your archive by finding datasets in your archive, and then be able to find more datasets in your archive.
Yeah. Well, I could say you are creating your own competitor then in Google as a way to finding your data. But that's maybe just a personal.
Well, you need to have some sort of strategy, and I agree. One of the problems that we had, for example, is that we had the same dataset on multiple places, and that was a huge problem, because then we would be a competitor to ourselves. Yes.
Mike, please.
Yes, I think this thing about names of data sets is very different from different research disciplines, because if you, I can imagine if you make like some kind of national social science study, it might have a name which is very well anchored in, and it's a huge data set, or maybe several different partial data sets under one umbrella. But in the community I come from, or domain, I mean, there our data sets, the names are pointing to a specific observation station and a variable name. So that's not necessarily something that you would be Googling for. So one has to also keep that in mind, that there is not one solution for all.
Yes, please.
Personally, I think that it's really domain specific, because in our repository we tried to polish our search engine, and basically our users still use Google to find datasets. So it was we basically just wasted time doing our own search, because still using Google.
I think kind of I'll just sort of slightly counter that a bit. Part of the function is actually to increase usability beyond your domain. And I think you have to kind of almost like listen out to kind of where are people coming into your services. And I think when you use things like Google Search Console to kind of listen into that conversation of what people are searching, that's really informative. And then you can actually leave breadcrumbs to actually draw people in. And you have to actively put out signposts that people will pick up. and come into the points where you want them to be.
And to improve visibility, catalog a repository in repository catalogs such as data, okay? That's very visible, that improves visibility. Second, link your repository to repository networks on the web. Link it to a hub, okay? Link it to the European hub, whatever. Catalog it, basically. We're not talking about data sets, right? We're talking about repository.
Yes, but then I think, I like the idea, but then I think it comes back to the same question, how can we ensure that the other catalog is, that we can find it? Because I'm talking from I'm absolutely the user here, so I have nothing to do with the repository catalogs, so I have no idea how I'm here, but that's a different discussion. And most of the times that I look for a data set, I'm Googling for it. Even if I know, for example, that there is an EOS marketplace or a repository that's specific life science oriented, I'll probably still Google it first, and then out of the options that will give me, I'll select the one that I recognize the repository of. So even if this link happens, which I'm absolutely in favor of, like having this recommendation to link it on known repositories and catalogs of other repositories, we still, I think we have to resolve this kind of an issue, how to increase this kind of a web search. Please.
I would go more in this direction to link to other catalogs. For example, in the material sciences, there are different catalogs and different facets. You find your data in a different way. And but more down there, there's an API you described in or EPMH interface. You know how to which other search engine search portals or other data banks that have their typical for the community specific presentation, like we have there's this periodic system to find the materials, but you have to as a data repository, you need an interface to this specific repository. So the repository owner, they need to know what potential clients there are, where to which have to make a research where to connect to, and so it's not only Google the search, and then this API is on the rest, and all these we need to find where to connect to our domain.
API is very important. You can't focus only on the web browser interface. Time that machine learning data pipelines are dominating. You want to build API.
Yeah, but you need to configure your API so that the search is advanced enough. I've bumped into several places where you can only make keyword searches, for instance. You can't and keyword searches, and then you end up with 10,000 things being returned and you're otherwise.
Well, that's a matter of design your API.
Yeah, so I was going to say kind of like know what your target audience is for the different routes you're looking at here as well, because you have technical solutions which are great for kind of aiding accessibility and discoverability of your data. You have to kind of put structures in place, that's good. But if you want to increase that wider visibility, and this is what the web presence aspect is particularly about, then that's a different type of audience and a different way of constructing how you're going to approach that. And I think that's an important part of this web presence is figure out what is your target audience and how you're going to improve towards that end goal.
That's a very
but they interact, but this is kind of taking the web presence to the view of it, how to then build to that.
Right. I don't see any other hands. So
I think it really depends if it's a domain repository or a generic repository. Okay, so the web presence of a domain repository is very different than the web presence of a generic repository. Distinct.
I fully agree on that. If you already know what to look for, you probably don't want Google search will just go into the correct repository. Please go ahead.
Sorry, very quickly, on top of arbitrary data, I think fair sharing should also be relevant.
Yes.
All right. So for sharing the
Yeah, to register the repository only.
Sharing.org.
all right.
There
So
are
this-
catalogs of repositories, right?
I was always having the first thing in mind as more of a registry of standards, but it actually does make sense. No, yeah,
Repository standards and policies, and they are interlinked.
You're right. Yeah. So yeah, it's already here. Cool. Thanks. All right. So based on the discussion so far,
are you monitoring the chat?
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah. So wait, I have opened here. Mingfang, I think, is copying stuff a lot from the chat into the Google document, or Kathleen, or someone. Right, so from the discussion here so far, I understand that we are pretty much in agreement on Rule 2 as well. Again, on principle, there are some things that we have captured here to better refine the actual scope, and the actual recommendations. So let me go to the next one under this one, which is the third one, which is here. So this is the literature part. Again, the recommendation here is make sure that this information, your repository, is present in the corresponding literature parts, because the motivation is that the most common used approach to find data is through the literature in itself. So if you read an article and you want to reproduce something, based on that, you probably start to figure out whether they exist. So you need to be present there. The recommendations here are about the knowledge graph to link data publication and vice versa, to have this bidirectional link, the data citation part, and of course that the repositories themselves should also clearly the citation information on the record pages so that this can be effectively used. There is the link on the PIDs for sure, so there's a clear link on that. But I would like to open the floor for any comments or thoughts on this particular rule. Yes, please.
This is again about finding and discovering things, right? Because from the literature, you get a reference to a definite, specific data set. So you find it.
All of them are about data discoverability. So yeah.
Well, the discoverability is also about finding unexpected things. So
right. Okay.
Yeah. So you would perhaps want a way to refer to a specific data set that also enables you to maybe learn about the repository in question. You might have never heard of it. So it might be interesting to offer a way of introducing the researcher to the repository that hosts that specific data set.
So I'm trying to figure out how this would be in practice in the literature part. So essentially have a predefined statement that together with data availability sort of have this as part of that. So I'm trying to think of it as a rule, if I were a repository, how to approach that. Leila, please.
I find this rule a bit odd, to be honest, because if I find something in Google, I will cite the publication that I find in Google. I will not cite Google's search engine.
Yes.
And this is like you found a data set in the data repository, you will cite the data set that you are using for your research. You will not cite the repository.
Exactly.
I don't know if that would be a new trend that we should push for, but right now, sounds a bit odd.
So Maggie and then Brigitte, please.
Yeah, I was thinking that this link between the data set and the repository or repositories where it might be located, if we could somehow insert that into the knowledge graph in a good way, then that would of course really aid this more spontaneous searching around for similar things or that might be at the same point of location, so to speak. But I don't really, I'm not at all very well familiar with what is being inserted into the knowledge graph at the moment. But I mean, if you can include funding information, you should be able to include the repository information.
I think the argument here was about the open air knowledge graph.
Yes.
The slash part, like it's sort of together. Right, so Brigitte, please.
So to my knowledge, OpenAir does include the data source, and that is usually the repository, although that could be more complicated through harvesting processes. But yeah, generally that is so. No, I mean, in many ways, the second you, almost anybody who will eventually download the dataset or even go through more thorough relevance assessment will click on the landing page and then automatically be referred to the repository website. And I'm not aware of any repository who makes a secret on the landing page of who they are. Usually it's like a pretty big banner right on the top. So I think that is more covered. I think if at all, we could even discuss if this is even a bit too much, but I see a lot of that people come in from Google, but then they stay because they're looking for a very similar data set and are trying to find it via our search engine. So this is one of the big use cases that we have.
Just a quick comment before I give the floor to Maggie. My impression of this rule is essentially the mirror of the previous one. So you're not searching for the data. The data has already been cited somewhere in the literature, and you want to make sure that the citation also has the appropriate information about the repository so that they can link it back to there. So increase the overall discoverability of other data in the repository through that. This is sort of my interpretation of that. So that's sort of the mirror of rule number 2. There is one comment from the chat which I really like, from Paula, that some journals have a limit. Some journals have a limit on the on citations and references, and this affects the inclusion of all the digital objects in the publication, which might also be a recommendation to keep in mind. Like if we want to implement that and have like multiple datasets represented, the repository should sort of make a recommendation that if you want to cite that, this would be the citation itself. Maggie, please.
Yeah, just a comment that in some research disciplines, the PID, which will come later, is actually not pointing to the page, but to the big stream itself. So again, one just has to be aware of the breadth of the practices.
Thanks. Leila.
Yes, I'm thinking about the metadata of the repository itself, and OpenAir, for instance, is harvesting other repositories. They should be citing all those other repositories. So I think this rule is kind of in double way. The repository should provide a way to be cited, but other repositories harvesting information from this repository should be also citing the repository that they are harvesting. And I don't really think that is a common practice nowadays, but it actually makes sense. If you're getting data from the repository, if you're doing aggregators, you should be citing all of those that you are harvesting. So maybe this literature and make it easier for others to cite you as a repository. It's more not for someone who is using a data set of the repository, but for most likely a machine, a tool that is harvesting things from the repository.
All right, that's useful. Yes, please.
Yes, the rule kind of really focus on scientific literature, but maybe we could also consider training materials and also policy recommendations. And this would be more at the level of maybe of data repositories and catalogs.
I really like the idea. Training materials are quite extensive right now for this purpose as well. So that's actually a very good point. Any other thoughts?
Just a quick one, which is I think some of this stuff we need to kind of keep in touch with the complex citations working group, because that's going to have a bit of an impact as well. And the other one is, yes, it's kind of like, okay, how do you connect literature to kind of the data resource? But I think it's also about providing an easy, usable way for the citation of the data to be used, to encourage that use. So, so whether it's providing the citation string, not just on the landing page, but also so that people can export it into their own tools, because that will actually encourage greater uptake and usage, which will then eventually feed back into the connections.
Thanks. Any other comments? All right. So again, it appears that we kind of have a consensus, a tentative one, but still, I'll take it. Let me move to the next one, which is number 6. So I'm going to scroll a bit down now. There we go. So the 6th one is about the broad search terms. So essentially here is the question of how can, what are the search capabilities that you can offer as a user if you kind of have a very broad search term as an input. In other words, how can you infer the user search intention?
Sorry.
That's a normal reaction.
Machine learning. Use those in your.
There are a few comments here about the Taylor expression. There are some citations here using the search logs as an input, and sort of have the general versus specific searches, reformulation of the same query and so forth. And also, as you can imagine, we have also the chatbots as an input here somehow. So I think the soul is about the downloaded files, right?
Yes, but you can just click it away.
Okay.
Click on it.
Yes. Sorry. Yes. Cool. Somehow better. Thanks. All right. So, any initial thoughts? Yes, please.
I think in order to all these tools to work, it's also important to think about the use of ontologies in the repository itself.
User ontologies?
Yeah.
Yes, so that you point out to metadata concepts and not only search terms.
Right.
Yeah, like looking for mesh terms rather than free text in public.
Semantics is important.
No, I agree. Again, I'm always thinking this, how I would approach it. And yeah, yeah, I know that the functionality is always there in most of the repositories I'm looking at. But as an extremely lazy person, I always sort of type things and try to figure out what's out there before I actually go to the advanced search and start actually putting the things in. This is my sort of my last step of it, but yeah, please.
Just instead of intention, use goal, because intention is very much culture dominated. I want to play with the repository, so I'm going around looking for anything, okay? There has been lots of studies on user intention, and it's a mess. Sorry, goals.
Okay. Yes, please.
Is it also related to multilingualism? Maybe allow users to query in their native language and
That's a very good point.
That's part of one, no?
Art?
Language diversity would be part of stakeholder.
That would be the user experience, yes. But also, I can definitely see the value of supporting multilingual sort of.
Correction.
Yes. So if the term is broad enough, you might try to see if you can fix that by using the appropriate language that the user is more familiar with. So if I go back to the actual name of this of the rule, so the rule now has been slightly updated to link broad terms to narrow terms, with the motivation being support other search across disciplines by using broader terms in addition to narrow discipline-specific terms, which sounds more specific now, but I think it's slightly shifted the original concept. I'm not against, again, this is the whole idea of having
Enable
this discussion.
narrowing the search, some perhaps, I don't know. Link is very implementation connected.
Yeah, I agree. Now it's more like this is how you should solve this problem, and before it was like, okay, be aware of this problem. So I actually like the old one a little better.
Mike, please.
But you might also want to do the opposite, because if someone is inputting things that will return no results, you could suggest maybe based on whatever previous information you have about searches.
But isn't
like an
the assumption
assistant.
that there exists a proper taxonomy with search terms? It is as if taxonomy still has to be invented. Not only you get taxonomies to search with. So I would say use proper search term taxonomies. You get everything to fit.
Everything
that's being mentioned here is about how people are solving the problem of finding stuff within their own repository, and that is going to depend exactly on which repository you're talking about. So actually, as a rule for all repositories, this doesn't really fit. It's more about know your user, which is back to the rule running it. So if you know your users, then actually how you're defining your search is dependent on that and what the stuff within your repository is.
I have a few comments, but please.
I mean, my comment is not about that, but maybe you want to.
All right, any quick reactions to that? Yes, please.
No.
No one. All right, so I'll see if I can take a reaction and then I can open with other questions. So I fully agree that there's a connection to the first rule for sure. I mean, it falls under the user group altogether in the first place. But I still consider that it's different to understanding what is the user and how they use your repository versus what are the functionalities that you need to be supporting because they are not using it because they don't exist in the first place. So the first one is understanding how they use your existing repository and how to improve that in order to improve the discoverability. This particular rule, as the way I see it, is more how can you effectively be more targeted in the search process itself when the user is basically looking and providing much more open-ended queries, which is again the connection of the ontologies that were mentioned already, or the terminology or the vocabularies, how to go from a very generic general query to something that really can retrieve the information that the user looks for. At least this is how I look at this rule. Of course, there's a connection, no doubt about that, but it's still kind of distinct. Yes, please.
Well, I mean, in terms of the recommendations, I think at the bottom you have conversational interfaces or something like that. I mean, that's a hot topic at the moment, and we have been discussing it in this LDA days. And I think one of the concerns that come out is the accuracy of the results and this. But my comment is most about that. Maybe it's not that you try to use chatbots, but probably investigate on the new large language model architectures there are for software, which might be something better for repositories to do this, which they already exist. They are growing, and many other organizations are using it already. We have seen someone that scopes the results of the response to a chatbot to call APIs that we already have in our repositories, get the results, and then format them again in a conversation. So more than say use chatbots, probably it's more about investigate about these LLM architectures and see what is better for your use case.
I like the idea. Yes, please.
Just back to the recommendation for terminologies or term taxonomies. If you recommend their use, then you will also need to recommend the methods to annotate the data sets with the terms, because it's real bottleneck, because it's really it is an expertise activity and also takes a lot of time. So either you need people to do the curation, or you need to have automatic or semi-automatic methods based on the analysis of the data sets or the descriptions of the.
We ask the depositor to do it at the time of commit, if at least suggest and encourage that they do it, because they know their data better than anyone.
Yes, but they're really reluctant to do it because it takes
time. Yeah, I know.
And also they don't always know the technology. So.
Well, even if they do know, because now I cannot, for this one I'm confident, even if they do know the taxonomy, they are always hesitant to do that because it takes time. And usually depositing data is like the last thing that everyone wants to do because they want to focus on other stuff. And so finding out what is the minimal amount of required metadata that you need to associate with any kind of data set is always kind of a balancing act of the repositories. But I like the point I put here. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the previous remark on
all right.
repository catalog. Sorry, it's going to need the same thing, and I think I both agree and disagree. But it could be easily solved if later on the document things are proposed. It's already as mentioned as user-driven solutions, so that you have like a list of problems you want to solve. And you can then say, okay, I have the issue knowing my users A, C, and Y, and there I can go to these solutions, rather than having a list and figure it out to do solution A, solution B. Go in with the issues.
Yeah. Someone else has already put it in here, but I also added it again. Any other comments? I should be managing the time much better than that. All right. Now I like the discussion. It's even if we manage to go through like 6% of that, I will be happy. So I'll go to rule 8 now. It's about the metadata needs. So this is basically the thing that we've just slightly touched upon, which is essentially what are the metadata that any user will require in a particular data repository. The motivation here is that the metadata needs actually shift a lot between disciplinary and between disciplines, and talking about general topics versus like specific ones. And ultimately it comes back to how this metadata being in practice used, like filtering the data sets, reselecting what to download, etc. There is already one of the outcomes of this group, this user requires recommendations for that repositories, that is kind of around this particular set, but ultimately the rule here would be to essentially understand and implement the metadata that the user needs for this particular repository. Any initial thoughts or comments? I'm looking at that as well. Yes, please.
Is it metadata for the repository or for the files that all files deposited should at least have these fields? What's the question?
So the rule would be to be aware, or as it's now being updated, consider your user's metadata needs.
Mm-hmm.
This essentially is translated to both what are the metadata that the user will need when they download and find the data, so how to filter. If you support metadata that no one is using, it's not really useful metadata. It might be useful from the repository point of view, but from a user point of view, you're not never going to use them, for example. So this is sort of the rule itself. Make sure that the metadata that you expose are actually the ones that are required for the user itself. Magic, please.
Yes, but this comes back to the age-old question from the OAIS and all of this. I mean, you can have a designated user community from the beginning when you set up your repository, but 5 years down the line, there may be active users from completely different communities. So this is not going to be a dynamic, because the form and the type of metadata that people expect to find at your repository when they are searching for data or looking for things can be very different, because you could start with the people only being mainly interested in some very broad taxonomy on the type of data set. Is it social science? Is it a registry study or whatever? But the others might later on really need to know variable names and go for that. The granularity and the coverage, I think, can change over time.
Mm-hmm.
So as a quick reaction, I would say that the input to this rule is also connected to the UX, to the rule 1, not the UX, the rule 1, as well as the one that we've just discussed about.
And the quality of the metadata.
Which is the next point. Yes, please.
And it also depends on the availability of data librarians, because if the people who are going to document the data are the scientists themselves, it's at most 5 fields. Okay, and including, as we learned from the first day, the name of the authors, which is the most important field, according to Hans, who presented data documentation. Okay, so in several areas, there's no data library. Several geographic areas.
Yeah, this is always it's a good recommendation to keep in this particular rule. I mean, you need to focus on that, but not to effectively implement that, you need data librarian. So it makes absolute sense to me. Yes, please.
Just a question about the user. We're speaking about personas and user testing, but what about the machines as users? How are they present in this user image? Are we sure that they have the same?
I cannot answer that, to be honest.
What about expanding the metadata with whatever you realize afterward that is useful to find the data? Making it live and change over time. Not removing, just expanding.
I'm not against the idea, but in practice, this means that at some point we'll have the metadata will be larger than the actual data. We should continue to expand that.
Why not?
I cannot answer that. Yes, please.
Yeah, so it's not just what metadata might the machine need, it's the form or format of that metadata, because of course it has to be machine at least interpretable. And that's also very important to keep in mind.
So
because a human can deal with a text field, free text field, but
so the format I understand. Whether the end user, the target user here about the metadata also includes machines or not is not something very clear in me as well. To be honest, I would imagine that there should be a significant overlap between those two, because essentially the machines should be looking for things that the people actually looking for.
Yeah.
But that's sort of my gut reaction, to be honest. Like, I haven't thought of it too much.
I think people commit, machines and people might commit at very different endpoints, and you've got to kind of tailor what you're doing to make sure it works for those types of users.
But typically, the machine doesn't ask for one document.
That's why it's consider your users' metadata needs, but the users could be the machine or it could be the person.
All right, so yes, please.
Yes, for domain-specific data, I think that minimal metadata recommendations for each type of data could be a valuable resource.
Is there any mention of domain standards there? Yes.
I think so. If I scroll it up. Yeah, it's essentially here, but make it more explicit.
Yes. I think there's another mention in the presentation, something just on the next page.
Could be. Ah, yes, you're absolutely right. Right, our computer. This one.
Oh, yeah, okay.
No, it's good. I'll just highlight again. All right, so as far as I can tell, there is kind of consensus, but this is one of the rules that we probably need to work a bit more to actually crystallize it a bit better compared to the other ones that we've gone so far. All right. Oh, yes, please.
Follow up and make sure there is validation for these standards and minimal information.
Cool, thanks. All right, so next one for this group, and I think this is the last one before we move to the other metadata improvement for discovery, is the data within data, which is rule number 7. Which is the
Just
one...
a time check for you.
I have the clock just above here, so I feel the pressure. Right, so this is about the data within data. So the question here is how to ensure that any kind of a search that is looking into particular, not subsets, but parts of the data that exist within data, for example, variables, is facilitated through that. There's like study level queries versus like specific variable level metadata. And the question is, what would be the recommendation around that? The motivation is clearly stated here, but as you can see, we don't have too much of how this could be implemented in that case. There are some questions about using machine learning to facilitate that, to connect other existing efforts like Dataverse in this particular case, and how this can be connected to different types of data. For example, we're connecting to text versus image versus video, which has completely different requirements if you're looking at information within information. There is kind of an article here about automated metadata annotation, which is sort of a review of what is actually possible with machine learning in this particular case. But all in all, is sort of, wait, what? Ah, cool. Stuff disappeared. But as it stands, sort of recommendations is around that. Any kind of thoughts?
It's dangerous.
Which part?
It's dangerous to do automated annotation of data.
Oh.
I think it's not dangerous if you have a human, again, checking, we've updated your metadata because you were too lazy to do it.
Yeah, that dangerous becomes expensive.
Okay. Yeah.
But where do you state the truth? If you're going to, if you find that there's something missing or it's wrong, at what point do you kind of make that change? At what layer? Where do you state it? And I think if you do that, you've also got to be clear that's what you've done.
You have the provenance of this has been automatically enhanced. This is the previous version.
And if people can be aware, actually, even your efforts might not be right.
Right. Yes, please.
Like one of the things that have been tried and that don't really work is that if you just put the variable level metadata in with the study level metadata, then people can't find anything anymore because variables don't have enough information to make search effective. But there's so many of them that they basically drawn out all the valuable study level information. And so I think the way that it has to be is that you have something like a hierarchical structure, and when we observe it, how people actually do it right now is they download the document and then they use Control F. Now, that's a way to implement it, but that's not something that the repository necessarily facilitated. So I don't have any good examples of people who have done that very convincingly. But I think it's one of these open topics that would really help people to be able to find data better.
Yes, please.
There's also the example that sometimes thumbnail images from the measurement data are presented in the catalogs.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Thumbnail images of the measurement.
Yes.
The feasibility may be different for generic versus domain-specific repositories, because in generic repositories you have it is more difficult to predict the kind of data, the formats, and so it is more difficult to apply automatic annotation or whatever, compared to specific repositories where you can more or less know what will be in and what will be also the vocabularies that will be used and
Right, so as far as I can tell, the last two rules are the more tricky ones for the time being. This is sort of my way of saying we need to start closing this session. I don't want to keep you from lunch. So what I would propose, because now I need to shift to the actual presentation somewhere. There we go. Does this work? No, I will do this one and it should work. It works, yay! And this is terrible now. Sorry, how do I fix that? Right, so I would apologize for the people remote. I will go to the last part, which is sort of this part. We've gone through these questions. So far, we've only captured the first group. We have some things for sure to do. I'm quite happy with the first 4, to be honest. Rule 8 and Rule 7 require a bit of a playing around with. But also I want to highlight that, if you can see here, Rule 6 and 8 are also appearing here as well. As we said in the beginning, this grouping is rather sort of arbitrary. It's sort of how you want to perceive them. So a lot of the things that we've already discussed will be applied in the second part as well. From here onward, because I want to go to the last slide, is essentially the next steps for us. So the one is all 3 of us, according also to the updated RDA rules, we've been co-chairs for the Data Discovery Group for a long time. Although we will continue to be present here and we will continue to contribute as much as right now, please consider this as an open call for new co-chairs to step forward. We're not planning to step down tomorrow, but we plan to transition slowly outside of this role by the end of this year, so probably by our next plenary. So if anyone here is interested, and I'm talking both within this group and remotely, we'll also be sending an email to the Data Discovery Interest Group later today. Feel free to step forward. We definitely encourage this kind of diversity, as RDA always promotes, and having more than 3 is always more than welcome. At some point we were 4, so we have reached this peak, but there are groups that have 9 and they work magnificently well. So please consider this as an open call. The second part is that we will be continuing this discussion and rules on a monthly basis. We have our a regular monthly call. I don't remember which. I think it's like a 3rd Thursday or something, but I can be completely off in my times right now, where we actually try to discuss and push forward these rules. Everyone is more than welcome to join. We send the reminder on our mailing list, this one. So if you're not already part of that Discovery Interest Group, please, and you want to continue contributing to this effort, please feel free to join. The plan, if all goes well, is to have this done by our next plenary, which gives us roughly 6 calls to make this happen, 6 months. So yeah, any kind of help is more appreciated. I think that's kind of it. This is the last slide. Please join. It's easy enough, you know the drill. I'd like to thank everyone here for sticking around, for your insights, for your thoughts, and of course everyone, all 30 odd people who are online, and especially Kathleen and Ming Fang, who were really key in helping this actually happen. And I put the faces there as well. Haha. Right, thanks everyone. Have a nice lunch. So we want to χαιρετήσω για το πίσω. Thank you for everything we are talking now. I'll stop sharing everything. I think this went rather well. So we're going to take a discussion over email. Thanks again for sticking around. Hi, it's me here. Hi, it's myself.
Thanks, Fotis.
I just realized that. Okay. Oh, nice. So thanks. Ciao.
We'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot, everyone.